Hello, welcome to another season of the Intel with Greg Cosell on the Inside the Birds platform. I'm Geoff Mosher alongside Adam Caplan, and with us for another season for several weeks of both free agency breakdown, NFL draft preview is our man Greg Cosell. You've seen him on our pregame show, on our other Inside the Bird shows, and of course from NFL Films. Greg, we haven't talked to you since basically the last pregame show of the Eagles season against the Buccaneers. A lot has happened. Two new coordinators,
just a few
to say
things
the
here
least.
To
say the least, a lot
that's
has
one
happened.
way to say it, Geoff. That's one way to say it.
Yeah, the most politically correct way to say it.
Yes.
But so before in this first episode, we're going to start off with free agency for the first 4 weeks, right? And this episode, we're going to get into the area the Eagles really, no question, have to address the most, and that's their pass defense, their secondary, defensive backs. But we really should start with just a little bit of a quick assessment from you on the two new coordinators, because a lot of what they bring is going to shape our conversations about the personnel they want to have. So Vic Fangio, defensive coordinator, Kellen Moore, offensive coordinator. Just your quick thoughts on what that means for the franchise.
Well, Moore is an interesting hire because Moore is very, very multiple in what he does. One of the things that you see a lot with Moore is the play action pass game where the quarterback's under center. And I'm fascinated to see if that's something that they're going to incorporate and integrate. We've not seen that really hardly at all. I mean, I would bet over the last 2 years, maybe even 3 years, I would bet Hurts has been under center 2% of his snaps. I don't have that number right in front of me, but it's obviously been a very small number. It's going to be very interesting to see how he incorporates that, because Kellen Moore sort of is a mixture of kind of the Jason Garrett offense, which is where he was kind of brought up, but also his own ideas with spread. So there's a lot of multiplicity. When you look at Moore, you see a lot of different things. So it's hard. And I had this conversation with a coach, who's been in the division, an offensive coach, been in the NFC East for a number of years, who said that, there's not one thing that he hangs his hat on, that there's a lot of things that are a part of his offense. So I'm really curious to see how that plays out. On the other side, I think it's too simplistic just to say that well, Vic Fangio's his quarters. That's sort of a beginning structure. But one thing about quarters is you can do any number of things from quarters because of where your safeties and your corners line up. And so that's also extremely multiple. Vic has played a lot more man coverage the last couple of years than people might think, because they think of him as quarters. He did that with Miami this past year. He did it certainly with Denver without question when he was Denver's head coach. So now, again, I spoke to someone who was on his staff in Denver, and they said one reason they played a lot more man is because of Patrick Surtain, who they thought was the best corner in football. Some might agree with that assessment. But the bottom line is there is a structure and foundation in place for the Fangio scheme, because we know Gannon ran it. We know Desai came from that. That's why they brought in Clint Hurtt. Clint Hurtt has a background in it. So obviously, they want to run that scheme, but it's not as simple as just saying, hey, it's quarters, and that's what they're going to play.
Greg, one thing on Fangio, you've studied him for many years, and he's coached and with many clubs, and he's had a lot of success. What do you really like about his system, if anything?
The late coverage rotation. The fact that there's a lot of movement, the picture changes from what it looks like pre-snap to what it becomes post-snap. That requires a lot of coaching, a lot of detail, a lot of nuance, because as you guys know, if one guy's wrong, particularly on the back end, you have problems. So, again, but that foundation theoretically, now that's different than playing the games, but theoretically, that foundation should be somewhat in place. Now, of course, it depends on who's going to be in the secondary this year, and that's one reason we're going to start talking about free agent defensive backs in a moment. But It depends. They might start bringing in different people, because the reality is it's hard pressed to think of the Eagles lining up right now with the same people they lined up with at the end of the season and feel like they're going to be a good secondary.
Great point. Let's start with safety, Greg. I know corner is a big deal, but they have Darius Slay at least. At safety, we have talked about on the podcast on Inside the Birds, the Eagles may not just need one, but two. as right now, Kevin Byard, his cap number is so high, it's hard. He will not be back at that number. So they may not bring him back.
Being
They might. We'll
realistic,
see.
Jeff, being realistic, he did not play that well, and he may be toward the end of his career. He was a
Correct.
great player, arguably the best safety in the game for a 2-3 year period. But I think we would all agree that the tape tells you that he did not play great football with the Eagles.
Right. So that if he did not come back, that really leaves the Eagles with Reed Blankenship, who we all believe is more of a number 3 safety, and Sidney Brown, who will be coming back from an ACL. So then you're looking at that saying the Eagles might need 2 guys here. And in the past, we've seen them maybe go after a big, like a second contract guy, and then try to bring in a 1-year stopgap while they wait for Sidney Brown to get better. So the names out there that I'm curious for you. We'll mention some names, and you say if they fit a Fangio defense or if they're just fit any defense. Obviously, in Washington, we have our eyes on Cam Curl, and in New England with Kyle Duggar. We do not know if these guys will be retained by a franchise tag, so we'll just work with what we've got right now.
2 players I really like. Again, it's always hard to know how, Vic Fangio sees them. Curl has predominantly been sort of a box player, and at times he played in the slot. Washington played a lot of big nickel with 3 safeties, which, I don't know if Vic Fangio will see that as a personnel package that he wants to play. I guess that depends on his personnel, because they need linebackers too. We'll probably get to that at some point, not today, but but Curl is a player I've always liked. Right from when I first saw him. The first time I really took note of him was a number of years ago. He was actually playing slot corner for Washington. This might be before they became the Commanders. So, and then he kind of became a safety, and he can play on the back end. He certainly can play in a quarter structure as a base look, a quarter structure. He's a physical player. He's just a good football player, I think. Duggar is very similar in that regard. He's a 220, 225 pound safety, kind of a combo safety linebacker. New England played a lot of big nickel, and he was a guy who normally played closer to the line of scrimmage. Sure, everybody has snaps on the back end, but that's not Duggar's game. He's not truly a back end safety, but he's a physical player. He's a good tackler. I think he's got good instincts in zone coverage. Sees what's in front of him really well. Another really solid safety kind of hybrid player. Again, always hard to know how Vic Fangio and the new staff will see these players, but I think you're looking at 2 solid veteran players that would clearly be upgrades.
Greg, let's stay with Washington.
Just before you jump on that, Adam, we're at the point they need upgrades. They need upgrades and they need competition. We're not, we're not saying that, hey, Ronnie Lott's going to fall out of the sky. They need upgrades and they need competition.
100%. So I know we get a lot of Commander fans watching. So how would Cam Curl fit in with Dan Quinn's defense? And he brought Joe Witt Jr., who's obviously worked with him in Dallas, so they're going to run their scheme. How do you think he could fit in if the Commanders bring him back, Curl? How do you think he'd fit in with Dan Quinn?
Fit really well, because what did Quinn do a ton of in Dallas? He played big nickel. They never played with 3 linebackers. I think they played 10 snaps, give or take, all year with 3 linebackers. They played with 3 safeties. They played with Hooker. They played with Donovan Wilson, and they played with Jaylon Curse. They played with 3 safeties. So Curl would fit perfectly in my mind anyway. Again, they have to evaluate the player, but I think, conceptually, he would fit perfectly in what Dan Quinn did. Hey, Dan Quinn may look at the personnel in Washington and think, hey, now I've got to do some different things. We don't know that. But based on his recent track record, Curl would fit very well in Washington.
Greg, guy who's out there, I think he was once a first-round pick, Darnell Savage, right, with the Green Bay Packers. Yeah. How have you evaluated him over the last few years?
Yeah, I always liked Darnell Savage. He's been hurt in and out of the lineup at times. He's another physical player, probably more in terms of traits like a strong safety than a free safety, but obviously has played on the back end. All safeties, as I mentioned earlier, do have to play on the back end at times. But I remember watching him coming out of Maryland. I really liked him. He was a first-round pick, right, Geoff, as you said?
Correct.
I believe so, yeah.
He was a later first-round pick, yeah. I think he's another really solid attitude kind of player. He's a tempo setter. He's physical. He's aggressive. Think he sees things pretty well. You know, he sort of falls into the same category of player that we were just speaking about with Duggar and Curl. You know, and I think they're all sort of attitude players that bring competitiveness to your defense. So, you know, he'd be, again, it gets back to the fact that they need safeties. They need to sign players, draft or sign players or both.
Greg, a guy came out of nowhere. In fact, he was cut by the Ravens his first year, and he's kind of worked his way through their lineup, and he became a starter. Is Geno Stone, another former seventh rounder? We talked about Carl was a seventh rounder, same draft, 2020. What about Geno Stone going forward?
Another Iowa safety. Those Iowa safeties pop up everywhere. You know, and Geno Stone is a back end player, and because he played when they put Kyle Hamilton in the slot, so that's so he played on the back end. He's really good on the back end as far as reading the quarterback and reading routes. That's the strength of his game, but he's a back end player, which doesn't mean he doesn't work. It's just that he's not necessarily a box player. You know, he's not a guy you'd play, you know, close to the line of scrimmage. But I thought that he had really good vision on the quarterback, on routes, made a number of really good interceptions this year. Now, interceptions, you can't count on that every year. Guy makes 5 or 6 in one year. Doesn't mean he's going to make 5 or 6 the next year, but that's his game. He's much more of a true back end safety.
So I'm always wondering about this and how you evaluate it, because the context, we always talk about context.
I just make it up, Geoff. I just make it up. That's
well, you could, really? Greg, and nobody would know the difference. But the Baltimore Ravens defense was so good.
Yeah.
Not just some of parts, but as a whole, right? I mean, even a guy like Clowney has his best year as a Raven. So I'm wondering, when you evaluate Geno Stone, do you have any questions about whether he plays at that level on a different team, compared to what, or in a different structure, not with surrounded by great players and a great play caller in McDonald?
You always, Geoff, that's a great question, by the way, and you always have questions about that. You know, I was a big baseball guy growing up. I know you're a baseball fan. What I'd equate that to is, let's say, a guy in baseball that bats 7th for a team and hits 30 homers, and then another team signs him thinking he's going to be their number 3 hitter. It doesn't always work that way, even though he had great numbers batting 7th. Right. So yes, I'm not saying that is the case with Geno Stone, but I think you have to figure that out the best you can. You know, obviously he's playing on a team that had a really good pass rush, that had some really cool pressure schemes. Even though they weren't a high percentage pressure defense, they had some really cool schemes. They had really good players in front of them. You know, arguably among the 2 or 3 best linebacker duos in the league in Queen and Smith. A pass rush that really was dominant at times with some players that people might not recognize, like Justin Matabuke. You know, so there was a lot going on here that really benefited Geno Stone, but I think just the way in which he played was a real positive. So now you have to decide, can he play that way if you bring him into Philadelphia? Or was he a function more of that particular defense? I'm being honest, that's a hard question for me to answer. I don't think I have enough information to answer that. Theoretically, teams would have enough information to answer that, but you still don't know 100%.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like he was a star at Iowa, and that was that's traditionally a great defense. I don't think anybody saw this from Geno coming.
Safeties in the NFL every single year, you know, so that was a great question. And there's no, like I said, I can't give a 100% answer, and there might not be a 100% answer.
Right.
Greg, 2 guys who played for Vic Fangio last year was the well-traveled Deshaun Elliott.
Yeah, and very well traveled.
Yeah, and Brandon Jones, who came off the ACL. What are your thoughts on these 2 guys?
I love Brandon Jones. I did before he got hurt. Now he played under a different coach prior to Fangio. I thought he was really good under the previous staff, where he was used very often as a pressure safety. I don't know, you know, how Vic Fangio now sees that, you know, the defense, and whether he's, because Vic, as we know about Vic Fangio, because he lives this stuff. Is he noodles all the time. He tweaks, he changes, he's constantly trying to do new things. So again, we can't say exactly what it's going to look like, Adam, but I remember for the 2 years that it was Flores and was it Josh Boyer? Was he the DC down there? Am I correct?
Yep.
Yeah. They were a pressure defense. And I thought Brandon Jones in that structure, because he was used a lot at the line of scrimmage, they would line up a lot with 6 and 7 man fronts. Usually Javon Holland was the post safety. So Jones very often was on the ball on the line of scrimmage. Didn't mean he blitzed all the time, but they had a lot of those pressure front looks. I really liked him. And then he got hurt a lot. And again, you have to factor that into the equation as well. What are the injuries? Do you feel like he can come back and be healthy for, 17 games or at least, 3/4 or more of them? But I like the player a lot.
How about Elliott? Sean Elliott.
Elliott is essentially, he's a true box player. He's almost another one of those hybrid safety linebackers. Remember, he was a big factor in Baltimore when Wink Martindale was there, and he was a major part of their blitz schemes. So he's more of that kind of player.
Greg, the Eagles sometimes get knocked out, not unfairly, but there's a misperception that they won't pay top dollar at safety. But we reported 2 years ago on Inside the Birds that they were up there with the Ravens as far as competitive offer for Marcus Williams. Marcus Williams just chose the Baltimore Ravens. I bring that up because we should talk just really quickly about Xavier McKinney and Antoine Winfield Jr. If these two guys wind up hitting the free agent market, one of them, if not both, will probably reset it. We're talking $17 to $20 million here, depending on what happens. If you look at those two and you think they don't play in Vic Fangio style defenses, but which one might acclimate? Which one do you like the most? How do you evaluate one versus the other for what the Eagles need from a safety?
I think Winfield and McKinney could play in any defense. I think Winfield is a complete safety. He can do whatever you want him to do. He can play on the back end. He sees things really well with vision and clarity. He can play in the box and be aggressive as a run defender. He's an outstanding blitzer. McKinney is the same. McKinney has played in the slot. He played in the slot at Alabama. He's played in the slot in the NFL. He's another guy that can play on the back end. He can play closer to the line of scrimmage. They're not the exact same player, but I think in terms of deployment within a defense, they can be used in a similar fashion. Winfield to me is a top 3 safety in the league. I think McKinney has traits to be, obviously that giant defense has had some issues, just because personnel. I mean, so it's hard to say that he's a top 5 safety, but I think he has the traits to be that guy if the situation allows it. So again, you make a great point, Geoff, as well about whether they're willing to pay, and who knows if those guys do hit free agency or not. But, Winfield is a guy, and he's not old. Winfield is still he's still on his first contract, right? This would only be his second contract.
Correct.
Right.
This will be second contract.
Yeah. So, I mean, Winfield to me, I'm not looking to spend the Eagles' money, and they'll do what they want, as we know. And they're not going to call me to ask me my opinion on whether they should sign Winfield. But
they're not.
Maybe they will. Sometimes they do. But
See what I mean?
Yeah. But anyway, Winfield is a guy that I would love to have, and I think he's a tempo setter for a defense, and I think they need that kind of player.
Time to move to corner, guys,
Yeah.
Unless you have anything else.
No, that's good.
Okay, so a guy that I don't think he'll make it, but it's not a lock that he's back with the Bears. But Jaylon Johnson, I know, has been very, very good. He's had some injuries. Where are you at with Jaylon Johnson, who Geoff and I got to talk to him before the 2020 draft, and he's such a good kid, but he's been hurt a bit. But man, everyone I speak
really
around
good,
the league, raves about him. Where are you at with him? And here's a question: is he a zone corner? Could he play in both? What are your thoughts?
Play both.
Okay.
Jaylon Johnson is a really, really good corner. And keep in mind that Bears defense, and a lot of people are unaware of this because all they talk about is Justin Fields. The Bears defense over the last 8 or 9 weeks of the season was one of the best defenses in the NFL.
Yeah.
And then, like I said, that's lost in the Justin Fields conversation and Caleb Williams conversation and all that. But Johnson, when healthy, again, I can't think of every corner off the top of my head right now. It's not the middle of the season, so haven't been watching NFL tape. I've been grinding college players, but I think at his best, with his size, his length, his ability to play press, his ability to play zone, he'd probably fall in the top 5 to 7 corners in the league. So, again, corners get money because it's a premium position. As we have found out with the Eagles, it's hard to cover up bad corner play. So corners get money. And again, then it just, you have to decide how much you're willing to spend, because at some point, there's certain positions where at some point, if you want good players, you're going to have to spend money. Otherwise, you're just trying to patch it together.
Yeah, a lot of good young players in that Bears secondary between him, Brisker, Tyreek Stevenson.
Tyler Gordon is a really good slot.
Kyler Gordon, right?
Plays
Yeah,
outside in their base. He's,
yeah,
he came out the same year as McDuffie with the Chiefs, two really good corners.
definitely. On the corner element, Greg, Adam and I were discussing on the last podcast, Christian Fulton, who was a guy who's missed a lot of games for the Titans. When he's on the field, though, does he give quality? Is he a guy that you like, or you're wincing? I can see already.
Because I do radio in Nashville, I've seen every one of his snaps. He's got traits, but he's been so up and down. I hate to use the word inconsistent. It's an easy word to throw around, just like instincts is an easy word to throw around. But to me, he should be better than he is because he has traits, but he hasn't been good enough. Gets beat a lot, has gotten beat over the top. And, again, maybe a change of scenery, change of coaching approach. This is no knock on the Titan staff at all. Sometimes these things just work out that way in the league. We all know that. Sometimes a guy who's got quality traits at a position goes to one team, it doesn't work, goes to another team, and somehow it gets unlocked. But he has traits, but he's not. I know the Titans feel, and the tape tells you this because I watch their tape every week, that he hasn't played to the level that they had hoped, given that he was a second-round pick and they thought he'd be a cornerstone at one corner position.
Greg, a guy that the Eagles have been high on in the past, and speaking of a former Titan at one point of his career, is Dory Jackson, who we know is a former first-round pick. What are your thoughts on him?
To me, at this point, I think he'd be a competition guy. I'm not saying you couldn't start him, but I don't know if you'd go after him with the idea that, we got a Dory Jackson, now we're all set. He's always been able to run, but another guy that I think is not quite the level you ultimately want as a starting corner at this moment in time.
Interesting. It's unlike safety or some other positions, it's hard to find, as you mentioned, it's hard to find a good corner in free agency that you think can come in unless somebody gets released. But obviously L'Jarius Sneed is a very good cornerback, but I don't see the Eagles being first in line to go get him.
Yeah, and he's going to get money, whether the Chiefs re-sign him, which they could very well re-sign him. He's a really terrific corner. They want him. Of course they do.
Oh, badly.
Yeah.
But the money, they got because they want Chris Jones back. But anyway, so on Sneed, how does he fit? We know they play a decent amount of man. Can he play both?
Everywhere. He fits everywhere because they play a lot of man. They play a lot of zone. Spags does a lot of different things. So he fits anywhere. You can play him outside. You can play him in the slot. He ended up staying outside this year because they moved McDuffie in the slot. But in previous years, he played in the slot when they went to their nickel and dime. But this year, he stayed outside. He's a physical press man corner. He can play zone. He can blitz. He's smart. He sees it. Sneed's one of the better corners in the league. Again, as I said, I don't have that list in front of me at the moment, but he is definitely one of the better corners in the league, and he's going to command a lot of money at him. It's just what I said a moment ago. If you want to get a really good corner, one that's hitting free agency, then you got to spend a lot of money. And if you're not willing to, you're not going to get that guy.
As Geoff said, there aren't a lot of them. They're just
Sneed and Johnson are two of those guys. The other guys we talked about are second or third tier guys. Sneed and Johnson are going to command a lot of money, and then you have to decide, do you want them? Because it's pointless to make a low ball offer. They're going to laugh at you. They're going to get a lot of money.
I get that.
They're going to get a lot of money. Adam, you deal with this all the time.
Yeah.
They're going to get a lot of money.
Yeah. Question for you, by the way, I know we'll do the draft stuff another time, but do you have an early feeling about the cornerback group with the draft? Do you think it's good overall? What are your thoughts on that?
I haven't gotten to many corners yet. I've looked at the Alabama guys. I'm trying to think because I haven't really been focused on corners yet.
Toledo corner? Have you seen the Toledo corner, Mitchell?
No, not yet. I'm gonna look at him. I've not seen him. I know that he's a lot of people are talking about him. So I just again I do a lot of positions early where I do a ton of guys. Like I've probably done 20 receivers. I've done, like the top 7, 8 quarterbacks.
Gotcha.
I'm jumping around now. So I've seen some corners, but I've seen the Lassiter kid from Georgia, who I really like. But I haven't seen 20 corners, so I can't. I
Gotcha.
can't.
All right. Well, we'll hit that down the road. Great.
Yeah.
So, Greg, let's say this. Last year the Eagles tried to find a good, solid 1 year contract veteran in Greedy Williams. It didn't work out.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean they won't try again, especially if they can acquire a cornerback via trade or draft one in the first round. They're still going to need maybe another one. So if we're looking at a 1 year deal, like there's a Steph Gilmore would be out there. Jeffrey Okuda is out there. Steven Nelson, a former Eagle who I guess played fairly decently
He played well. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A guy who played for Vic Fangio last year was Eli Apple. So there's a bunch of guys here who are in their like late 20s or probably looking at 1 year deals that I just mentioned. Does anybody, Shaq Griffin, does
Well,
anyone kind of stand out to you and say, I like that? That's a good value right there.
your point raises a larger question, Geoff. Is what do you want to do with the corner position? Do you want to try to stop gap it every year? Which again, it's their money, not mine. I can sit here and say whatever I want. It's ultimately meaningless. I would not look at the cornerback position that way. That's not the way I would see it. I think it's such a premium position in today's NFL that you have to go out and you've got to get big time corners. And you're going to have to pay for them, and you got to pay them.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that,
So-
and that's why we went through the big names. But I
Right,
also
right.
believe that I've watched how you've watched how they do acquire. They like to
Right.
acquire some veterans for depth to maybe be a placeholder for a first round pick or a second round pick, right? And there are so many guys I notice on this list who all seem in that same neighborhood where they could serve that role on a 1 year deal. You don't have to start them, or
Right.
they're your veteran depth. And I'm just wondering if any of
Well,
them.
let's
I kind
think
of
of
thought
it-
his tape was good.
Let's think of it this way. We know that Darius Slay, even though he's not the player he once was, is going to be back at corner.
Correct.
I know Adam's talked about Bradbury's contract, but
Yeah.
the reality is this, and they can say what they want publicly. You cannot put James Bradbury out there. You cannot, not at outside corner. The team's going to know it. The new staff's going to know it. You can't do that. So I don't know what that means as far as whether he's on the roster or not. That's the stuff I don't follow closely enough. Adam, follows that more closely, and there may be other ways I don't know the answer to that, but you can't put him out there. So now who's going to play outside corner opposite Slay? Because Slay is going to be here.
Yes, that's a lock. He's not going to.
Yes.
Yeah, and he's not quite the player. You have to understand that, but he's going to be here. So what do you want to do with the other corner? I mean, look, obviously Eli Apple is now familiar with the Fangio system. Eli Apple's always had traits. He's been with a lot of teams for any number of reasons. I'm sure
There's a reason, right?
Yeah, there's reasons for that.
Yeah.
Eli Apple from Voorhees, New Jersey, by the way, from Eastern High School.
Yep.
But he certainly knows the system. He knows the terminology. He knows the methodology. He's going to know the checks and all that stuff that go with it. That means a lot, by the way.
Oh gosh, yeah. Go look at the Eagles last year. They didn't know anything what they were doing out there. I mean, they were so confused.
And Apple is long and he is athletic. And, while you wouldn't call him a star corner, Apple's wherever he's been okay. I mean, he's never really been bad. He's just never become the star that his draft selection, would suggest. But he's never been bad. He must have other things going on that maybe you guys know. You follow that more closely than I. And that's the reason he's been with so many teams.
Well, it's been 5, and he does turn 29, not too long. So you always worry about why these guys keep moving on if they're good enough. So
right.
I think to sum this up, if you're a team that wants a corner, you're probably going to have to draft one. If you don't want it, the stopgap guy, which is what we were talking about. Now at safety, there's some names out there that we'll see remember the Giants staff. They didn't draft him. Now, Greg, you just outlined how talented McKinney is. Now he's had some injuries. He had the off the field issue with the SUV, which is unfortunate, hurt his hand, but he's obviously very gifted. Now there's some safeties out there, but the bottom line is, and we'll talk more about this when we do draft stuff with you. If you want a corner, you're probably going to have to draft one. You're talking about a starter. If you want a safety, there's some guys who could potentially get out there, but you're also going to have to pay.
that's the bottom line. You have to
Yeah.
decide as an organization what you want to do. I mean, we're going to get into the same conversation with linebacker. I mean, we know in the past that has not been a priority position, and maybe, Adam, you might say, well, it still won't be, and that's fine.
Yeah.
They have their own philosophy, but then you look at the teams in the Final Four and the Super Bowl, and you look at their linebacker positions. They got big time players. Now, I'm not saying that's the key to every defense in the NFL, but at some point, you look at the Niners, Warner and Greenlaw. You look at, the Ravens were in the semifinals, Queen and Smith. You look at the Chiefs. Bolton's a big time player. Tranquil's actually a very good player. I think he might be a free agent too. We'll get to this, but you have to decide what's important and how you think you can play. And the reality is, the Eagles this year, their back group, in counting linebackers, was just not very good. It was not good enough to play in the National Football League. And that's a tape point. That's not an opinion. It's not a hot take. It's not, it's a tape comment. They were not good enough.
Sure. All right. We will transition to Nichols as we finish this up. Real quick, though, on your point on Eli, 8 seasons in the NFL. He's been to the playoffs 6 times. So he's got experience.
Yeah.
I mean, he's been, nobody's saying that's because they had Eli Apple, but the man has had experience for 4 or 5 different teams in the playoffs. So I think, and again, under Vic last year, and they were a playoff team. So let's transition to Nichols. It's not an easy position per se to find. And I want to ask you about another Vic Fangio guy. He played for Miami last year, Nick Needham. Anything that jump out about him?
Nick Needham, yeah, he's a guy that's been in and out of the lineup. He's played outside and inside. To me, when it was a couple of years ago when he played a lot. I can't remember whether it was 2 years ago or 3 years ago, but he played
3.
a lot.
Yeah.
Was it 3?
Yeah, because he had, I think, an ACL 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken.
I kind of liked him that year when he played a lot, but he's been hurt a lot. He's an unknown at this point. I mean, you're bringing him in. If you sign him, you'll get him on a 1-year deal, more than likely, and you're bringing him in as a competition player. You're not bringing him in to say he's the guy to play anywhere. You're bringing him to competition. Hope he has a great off-season training camp, and you're truly surprised and happy with what you see. But
Gotcha.
But that's why you'd be bringing him in.
And then 2 more Nichols, a guy you've talked about a lot in our show, Jordan Lewis, and then Kenny Moore's a guy who's a pretty good player. I know can play inside or outside. Give us your intel on these guys.
Well, Kenny Moore, at one point, to me, was one of the best slot corners in the league. Now he plays outside in their base. That's what he's done in Indy. He's a good player. Another guy that I think brings it a little bit of an attitude, smart guy, understands a lot of things. I don't believe he's ever played in a Fangio style defense, but he's smart, he's savvy, he's aware. I've seen him make some interceptions where he, baited the quarterback and did a really good job of that. I've always liked Kenny Moore a lot. He's getting up there. How old is Kenny Moore, Adam? Offhand?
I'll tell you in a second. I got to think he's late 20s. In fact, I remember I met him at the Super Bowl. We talked about that. He played for Belichick. He was a big Belichick fan. He turns 29 in August.
Yeah, so he's not old. I think he'd be a good signing. Now, I don't know, to me, he may not be a one year guy. He may be a guy that gets a deal, not a big, he's not going to get, I'm not saying he's getting 3 years at a ton of money, but you may have to pay him a little more because he's a quality player.
Let's finish up.
Jordan Lewis.
Jordan Lewis.
Yeah.
I mean, he's another guy, he's been with Dallas. He's a true slot. I think I hate to use words that don't mean a lot. I was going to say, I think he's okay. That's not really a good scouting word to use. I think he's another one of those competition guys. You bring him in. Could he win the job? I mean, what's Avonte Maddox's deal? He's still under contract, right?
Yeah, he's
no guaranteed money, right, Adam?
None. No. So it's
his
situation is tenuous.
So they're starting from scratch with him. I mean, he could easily be released if they don't like him, and they could go in another direction. Lewis is, I think he's been a solid player in his career. He's made some plays against the Eagles, as we know. So he's a smaller guy. It all depends what you're looking for in the slot. But yeah, he's you could do worse than Jordan Lewis, obviously, because he has a lot of experience, and that's where he plays.
All right, we'll finish it with this name. He's not exactly a free agent. He's actually an Eagle who's under contract, but we constantly get people telling us our listeners, you're forgetting about Isaiah Rodgers, who A, did not play at all last year, and B, I think people just assume he's a nickel because he's a short guy when
He played outside for Indy.
Yeah. So we're talking about a guy who hasn't played in a year and doesn't have a ton of nickel experience. But what do you remember about him?
If a guy he played outside for Indy, he ended up winning the job. I remember 2 years ago. Was it 2 years ago or 3 years ago?
I think it was 2 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
Two.
I mean, I wouldn't be counting on him as hey, we're good at corner now that Isaiah Rodgers is here.
Of course.
Right.
I wouldn't see it that way. Look, they're at the point where someone has to win that job opposite Slay. They're going to have competition. They're going to have to bring people in. They're going to have to decide whether they want to pay or try to do stopgap again. I don't know what's their cap situation like, Adam.
It's not set yet because they're getting through some. They'll I'm sure they'll have some restructures. From what we understand, it's going to be just okay, but they always
how he can restructure a million contracts to clear.
Well, not a lot. They're actually not a lot left, but what I was going to say is
obviously they don't have to deal with the quarterback.
They'll get through it. I'm not.
But they're good with him.
About it.
What's that? They don't have to deal with the quarterback. What's Devonta Smith's status?
Well, he's now eligible. So is Landon Dickerson to get extensions. And you know what they do, Greg, is they make it simple for people to understand. The first year cap number of these extensions is always low. So that's the way they're able to get they're able to get through with this, and then the cap rises.
Obviously it comes down to what you prioritize, what you want to spend your money on. But at the end of the day, there are certain positions that if you want good players, you're going to have to spend money. And if you're not willing to do that, you're going to get what they have. You're going to get stopgap guys in the hope that they play well. You mentioned Steven Nelson, who indeed played well for Houston this year, but he was another example of that. They brought him in a few years ago, didn't play particularly well for Philly, ended up playing well for Houston. But, that's a stopgap. Right. I mean, if you decide, hey, you know what? And again, I don't know how they want to deal with their cap, but let's say you decide, you know what, let's stop with the stopgap stuff. Let's go ahead and get a corner and a safety. And let's just go get the guy and pay him, pay both. Then let's say you decide you want to do that with Winfield and Snead and they both decide they want to come to Philly, then you're set. Then you don't have to worry about that. Now, I know there's cap ramifications and I don't know all that, so I'm not pretending I do. But at some point, you're going to have to pay at some point.
Got to pay the piper. And sometimes you got to rob Peter to pay Paul, as they say in this business. So we'll see the effect of that. Greg, this has been great. We've done outside corners, inside corners, safeties. I think we ran through a lot of names. How about next week we do edge rushers? Next episode, we'll do that. Is that good?
Sounds good. I'll work on my 3-point stance and see if I get off the ball quick.
All right.
Hey, could you stand up, Greg? Could he stand up as a pass rusher, Greg, back in the day? Could you do that?
Well, it's funny. When I didn't play football in high school because my high school didn't have a football team. So I played basketball and baseball. But when I went to Amherst, because the football coach, I guess, would talk to the baseball and basketball coach and said, hey, this guy we're bringing in, he's a pretty good athlete. They wanted me to play football and they wanted me to be a defensive end. Because at Amherst, you didn't have to be, and this is a long time ago too, obviously. They didn't.
That's when you were 6'4"? Were you 6'4" then?
I was 6'4" then. Now I'm not.
Now you're 6'1" now?
Yeah. But
sorry,
I chose not to play football. So but they
chose not to play.
Yeah, they wanted me to be a defensive end.
Well, you got long arms.
They wanted me to get up to 225, which you can do at Amherst Division III, but I just didn't want to do that.
Awesome.
Nice.
All right, we'll do it again next episode, Greg. Thanks so much for joining us. This has been another The Intel with Greg Cosell. Thanks for watching.